We live in an age that has declared war on beauty. Walk through any modern city, and you will witness the triumph of utility over grace, function over form, convenience over contemplation. The buildings assault rather than uplift, the advertisements scream rather than speak, and the public spaces repel rather than invite. This is not merely a matter of taste, it is a profound spiritual crisis that reveals something essential about who we have become as a civilization. Beauty is not a luxury or an ornament we add to life when more pressing concerns are satisfied. It is a fundamental human need, as essential to our well-being as truth and goodness. When we surround ourselves with ugliness, we diminish our capacity for wonder, reverence, and the sacred. We become spiritually impoverished, even as we accumulate material wealth. The question before us is not merely aesthetic but moral. Can we rediscover why beauty matters? Can we understand that our hunger for the beautiful is really a hunger for meaning, for connection to something greater than ourselves? In defending beauty, we defend the very possibility of a life worth living. The stakes could not be higher, for a civilization that loses its sense of beauty loses its soul. Chapter 1: The Nature of True Beauty. Beauty is not in the eye of the beholder, as our relativistic age insists. This modern dogma has done more to destroy our aesthetic sense than any totalitarian regime could achieve through censorship alone. True beauty possesses objective qualities that speak to something universal in human nature: proportion, harmony, rhythm, and what the ancients called the splendor of form shining through matter. When I stand before a Bach fugue or gaze upon the west front of Chartres Cathedral, I am not projecting my personal preferences onto neutral stimuli. I am encountering something that embodies mathematical relationships found throughout creation, the golden ratio that governs the spiral of a nautilus shell and the proportions of the human face, the harmonic series that resonates in both musical chords and the orbital patterns of celestial bodies. This is why traditional cultures across the world, despite their profound differences in language, religion, and custom, converge on remarkably similar aesthetic principles. The Chinese concept of Li, the Islamic notion of Jamal, the Greek idea of kalos, the Sanskrit term sundaram, all recognize beauty as a transcendent reality that calls forth our highest aspirations and noblest responses. The universality of certain aesthetic experiences points to something deeper than cultural convention. When a person from any background encounters the aurora borealis, a perfect rose in bloom, or a mother cradling her newborn child, they experience a recognition that transcends learned responses. They witness what Plato called the form of the beautiful itself, that eternal pattern of which all earthly beauties are but shadows and reflections. Modern art's systematic rejection of these principles is not liberation but spiritual impoverishment. When we abandon the pursuit of beauty for the sake of novelty, shock value, or ideological statement, we severed our connection to the accumulated wisdom of humanity. We became aesthetic barbarians, unable to distinguish between the sublime and the merely sensational, between art that elevates the soul and spectacle that merely stimulates the nervous system. Beauty civilizes us because it teaches restraint, reverence, and recognition of something greater than our immediate desires and appetites. It cultivates what Edmund Burke called the experience of the sublime, that encounter with infinity that reminds us of our proper place in the cosmic order. Without regular exposure to beauty, we lose our capacity for transcendence and become trapped in the prison of our own subjectivity, mistaking our passing moods for eternal truths. The recovery of beauty begins with the humble recognition that we are not the measure of all things, that there exist standards of excellence that precede and transcend our personal opinions. Only when we submit ourselves to these higher standards can we begin to see with eyes unclouded by the prejudices and fashions of our particular moment in history. Chapter 2: The Modernist Assault on Beauty. The 20th century witnessed an unprecedented and systematic assault on beauty in the name of progress, liberation, and social justice. The modernist movement, Beginning with the avant-garde experiments of the early 1900s and culminating in the architectural brutalism that still scars our cities, explicitly rejected the accumulated aesthetic wisdom of millennia in favor of radical experimentation and ideological purity. This rejection was not accidental but programmatic, driven by a utopian vision that saw traditional beauty as complicit in the oppression of the past. The Bauhaus school declared that ornament is crime, echoing Adolf Loos's earlier manifesto against decorative elements in architecture. Le Corbusier conceived of houses as machines for living, systematically stripping away every element that might lift the human spirit or connect inhabitants to their cultural heritage. The philosophical error underlying this movement was the fatal confusion of artistic freedom with the wholesale rejection of all constraints and conventions. True artistic freedom, however, emerges from working creatively within forms that have proven their capacity to embody human meaning across generations. The sonnet liberates Shakespeare's genius precisely because its strict constraints force him to discover new possibilities within established patterns of rhythm, rhyme, and meter. In music, the abandonment of tonality in favor of serialism and atonality reflected the same misguided impulse toward systematic iconoclasm. Schoenberg's 12-tone system was intellectually ingenious and mathematically sophisticated, but it proved aesthetically sterile because it severed music from its roots in the natural harmonic relationships that govern both the physical universe and human perception. The result was music that could be appreciated only by academic specialists, a profound betrayal of music's democratic power to move all human hearts regardless of education or social position. Where Bach's chorales or Mozart's symphonies speak immediately to both peasant and prince, serialist compositions require extensive theoretical preparation to be understood even intellectually, let alone loved. The tragedy of high modernism is that it began with genuine insights about the need for cultural renewal and artistic innovation, but ended by destroying the very possibility of meaningful renewal. In their revolutionary zeal to escape the supposed tyranny of the past, the modernists forgot that tradition is not a dead weight that crushes creativity but a living stream that nourishes new growth. They created not a brave new world but an aesthetic wasteland, sterile, meaningless, and ultimately inhuman. We are still living with the devastating consequences of this great aesthetic mistake. Our cities remain monuments to modernist ideology, our public art celebrates transgression rather than transcendence, and our young people grow up in environments that systematically assault rather than nourish their natural aesthetic sensibilities. Chapter 3: Beauty and the Sacred. The connection between beauty and the sacred is not accidental but essential, rooted in the very structure of human experience and the nature of reality itself. In every traditional culture, without exception, the most beautiful objects were created for religious purposes, temples that reach toward heaven, icons that make the invisible visible, sacred music that carries the soul beyond the material realm, liturgical vessels that transform ordinary elements into channels of grace. This universal pattern reveals a profound truth about the function of beauty in human life. Beauty serves as a natural bridge between the material and spiritual realms, making the transcendent accessible to embodied beings like ourselves. When we encounter true beauty, we experience what Rudolf Otto called the mysterium tremendum, a sense of awe that combines irresistible attraction with profound reverence, drawing us beyond ourselves while reminding us of our finitude. This is why a Gothic cathedral affects even the convinced atheist, why Bach's Street Matthew Passion moves hearts regardless of theological conviction, why Islamic geometric patterns inspire contemplation in believers and non-believers alike. Beauty awakens in us the recognition that there is more to reality than meets the eye, more to existence than the material processes that science describes so well but cannot ultimately explain. The systematic secularization of our culture has not eliminated this fundamental human need for encounters with the sacred but has tragically misdirected it. When people lose their conscious connection to transcendent reality, they do not stop worshiping, they begin worshiping themselves, their desires, their political ideologies, their ethnic identities. The result is the proliferation of pseudo-sacred art that characterizes our contemporary moment, installations designed to shock rather than inspire, music that assaults rather than elevates, buildings that intimidate rather than welcome the human spirit. This process of desacralization has profound and largely unacknowledged psychological consequences for individuals and societies. Human beings require regular encounters with beauty because they need regular reminders of their higher calling, of their capacity to transcend the merely animal level of existence. When we systematically surround ourselves with ugliness, we begin to see ourselves as merely material beings, subject to the same blind purposelessness that characterizes our degraded environment. The recovery of beauty in our time, therefore, necessarily requires the recovery of the sacred dimension of human existence. This does not necessarily demand a return to traditional religious observance, though such a return would certainly be beneficial for both individuals and society. It means recognizing that we are fundamentally spiritual beings whose deepest needs and highest aspirations cannot be satisfied by material goods alone, no matter how abundant or sophisticated. Sacred beauty teaches us essential virtues that secular education systematically neglects. It teaches humility by reminding us of our finite place in an infinite cosmos. It teaches gratitude by revealing the gift character of existence itself. Most importantly, it teaches us the difference between love and mere desire, not the possessive urge to consume and control, but the reverential desire to protect and serve what we recognize as intrinsically precious and worthy of care. Chapter 4: The Economics of Ugliness. Our contemporary aesthetic crisis is not merely cultural or philosophical but fundamentally economic in origin. We live within a market system that has systematically reduced beauty to just another commodity and commodified virtually everything that previous generations held sacred. When beauty becomes merely another product to be manufactured, marketed, and consumed, it inevitably loses its power to transform and elevate human experience. The inexorable logic of mass production demands standardization, efficiency, and cost reduction, values that are often directly antithetical to the patient creation of beautiful objects. A handcrafted Windsor chair made by a traditional craftsman embodies human care, accumulated skill, and loving attention to detail that no factory production line can possibly replicate. Each piece bears the unique mark of its maker's personality and reveals the subtle variations that give handmade objects their particular charm and character. Yet economic pressures in our globalized marketplace consistently force consumers to choose quantity over quality, convenience over craftsmanship, immediate satisfaction over long-term value. The result is the aesthetically impoverished landscape of modern commercial civilization: endless strip malls, generic chain stores, and housing developments that could exist anywhere and therefore truly belong nowhere. This economic logic has infected even our approach to high culture and the arts. Art becomes content to be consumed, music becomes product to be marketed, and architecture becomes mere real estate development focused exclusively on maximizing square footage and minimizing construction costs. Museums transform themselves into entertainment venues, orchestras program only crowd-pleasing works, and architects design buildings that photograph well for magazines but fail utterly as human environments. The problem is compounded by our consumer culture's pathological emphasis on novelty and planned obsolescence. Beautiful objects in traditional societies were made to last for generations, embodying the maker's hope that future generations would find them worthy of preservation and care. Modern consumer goods are deliberately designed for rapid obsolescence, reflecting our culture's temporal myopia and fundamental lack of concern for historical continuity. But there exists an alternative economic model that naturally prioritizes beauty, permanence, and human flourishing over mere efficiency and profit maximization. Traditional craft guilds understood that the pursuit of excellence in one's chosen work was simultaneously an economic and spiritual discipline. The medieval stonemason took pride not merely in the wages his labor commanded but in the beauty he brought into the world and the contribution he made to his community's cultural life. We urgently need to recover this understanding of work as vocation rather than mere employment, as participation in the ongoing human project of making the world more beautiful rather than simply earning money to purchase the products of others' labor. When we approach our daily tasks, whether carpentry or cooking, teaching or gardening, accounting or medicine, with the craftsman's traditional concern for excellence and beauty, we transform both ourselves and our immediate environment. We become active co-creators rather than passive consumers, conscious participants in the ongoing work of cultural creation and preservation. Chapter 5: Education and the Cultivation of Taste. The crisis of beauty in our time is fundamentally a crisis of education, a catastrophic failure to transmit to rising generations the knowledge, skills, and refined sensibilities necessary to recognize, appreciate, and create beautiful things. Our educational institutions teach technical competencies and ideological positions but systematically neglect the patient cultivation of taste and aesthetic judgment that once defined the very essence of liberal education. True aesthetic education must begin with sustained exposure to exemplars of excellence across all the arts. A child who grows up surrounded by great painting, sublime music, and noble literature naturally develops what we might call aesthetic muscle memory, an intuitive sense of quality and proportion that serves as the indispensable foundation for later critical judgment and creative work. This is why the systematic destruction of our cultural inheritance through educational neglect represents such a catastrophe. It deprives future generations of the living examples they desperately need to develop their own aesthetic sensibilities. But genuine aesthetic education cannot remain merely passive absorption of cultural treasures created by others. It necessarily requires active participation in the demanding creative process itself. When a child learns to draw with accuracy and grace, to play a musical instrument with skill and expression, or to recite poetry with understanding and feeling, they develop not only specific technical abilities but also a profound appreciation for the extraordinary difficulty and genuine beauty of artistic achievement at the highest levels. Through this hands-on engagement with the creative arts, students learn that authentic creation requires rigorous discipline, patient practice, and humble submission to objective standards of excellence that transcend personal preference and contemporary fashion. They discover that true self-expression emerges not from the anarchic assertion of individual will but from the disciplined mastery of inherited forms and techniques that have proven their worth across generations. Our contemporary educational system has largely abandoned this traditional understanding in favor of a false egalitarianism that treats all forms of expression as equally valid and valuable. The fashionable doctrine of aesthetic relativism may appear kindly and democratic on the surface, but it actually cheats children of their birthright, the opportunity to develop their natural faculties of discrimination and aesthetic appreciation to their fullest potential. It is comparable to teaching mathematics while insisting that all numerical answers are equally correct. The recovery of serious aesthetic education requires both fundamental institutional reform and renewed personal commitment from parents, teachers, and community leaders. Adults must take responsibility for systematically exposing children to the very best that has been thought and said, painted and composed, built and crafted throughout human history. They must insist on genuine standards of excellence while providing the patient guidance and encouragement necessary for young people to achieve those standards through sustained effort. Most importantly, we must remember that aesthetic education is inevitably moral education as well. When we teach children to love what is genuinely beautiful, we simultaneously teach them to love what is truly worthy of love. We prepare them not merely for successful careers but for meaningful lives, for the lifelong task of creating significance and purpose in a world that often appears chaotic and meaningless. Chapter 6: Architecture and the Human Scale. Nowhere is our contemporary aesthetic crisis more immediately visible or more profoundly consequential than in our built environment. The buildings we construct and the spaces we inhabit reveal our deepest assumptions about human nature, human needs, and what constitutes a life worth living. Traditional architecture, whether classical or vernacular, recognized that human beings require not merely efficient shelter but environments that actively nourish their spiritual, emotional, and social well-being. Classical and vernacular architectural traditions achieved this goal through careful attention to human scale, extensive use of natural materials, and incorporation of decorative elements that provide visual interest while conveying cultural meaning and community identity. A Georgian terraced house in London or a Cotswold cottage in the English countryside creates an immediate sense of home and belonging because it was designed with human proportions and human psychological needs as primary considerations rather than mere afterthoughts. These traditional buildings age gracefully and grow more beautiful with time because they were constructed using materials, stone, brick, timber, slate, that improve rather than deteriorate with weathering and use. They embody what John Ruskin called the lamp of memory, connecting present inhabitants to past generations while suggesting the possibility of a meaningful future built upon inherited foundations. Modernist architecture, by stark contrast, consistently treats human beings as abstract statistical units to be efficiently housed rather than as embodied souls with complex emotional and spiritual needs that transcend mere physical survival. The glass boxes and concrete towers that dominate our urban skylines may represent impressive engineering achievements, but they systematically fail as humane environments that support authentic community life and individual flourishing. The psychological and social effects of living and working in such alienating environments are profound and largely unacknowledged by architects, planners, and policy makers. When we surround ourselves with buildings that ignore human scale and human needs, we inevitably begin to feel estranged from our own environment. We lose the fundamental sense of belonging and rootedness that comes from inhabiting places designed to acknowledge and celebrate our full humanity rather than merely our economic function. The solution is emphatically not to abandon all modern building techniques and conveniences in favor of a nostalgic return to pre-industrial methods. We can and should incorporate central heating, modern plumbing, electrical systems, and contemporary safety standards while still creating buildings that respect traditional proportions, employ natural materials, and contribute positively to community identity and social cohesion. This requires a fundamental shift in our understanding of architecture's ultimate purpose and social responsibility. Buildings should not merely provide efficient spatial containers for human activities but should actively contribute to human flourishing by creating environments that inspire, uplift, and connect us to both our immediate neighbors and the larger human tradition. They should tell the story of the people who inhabit them, reflecting shared values, cultural aspirations, and historical continuity rather than the abstract theories of architectural intellectuals. Chapter 7: Beauty as Resistance. In our current cultural moment, the deliberate pursuit and preservation of beauty has become an act of fundamental resistance against the forces of degradation, relativism, and despair that dominate contemporary intellectual and artistic life. When virtually everything around us conspires to lower our standards, diminish our expectations, and convince us that excellence is either impossible or irrelevant, the simple act of creating, maintaining, or defending something genuinely beautiful becomes a form of cultural warfare with profound political and spiritual implications. This resistance must operate simultaneously on both personal and communal levels, requiring both individual commitment and collective action. On the personal level, it means steadfastly refusing to accept ugliness as inevitable or normative. It means taking genuine care of our homes, our gardens, our dress, and our manners. It means actively seeking out opportunities to encounter authentic beauty in museums, concert halls, historic buildings, and natural landscapes. It means choosing to read books that elevate rather than degrade, to listen to music that inspires rather than merely stimulates, to surround ourselves with objects that embody craftsmanship and care rather than mass-produced disposability. But personal cultivation and aesthetic refinement, however admirable, are not sufficient to address the scope of our cultural crisis. Beauty is inherently social and communal. It naturally calls forth a community of recognition among those who share the capacity to perceive and cherish what is excellent. We must therefore work together to preserve and transmit the irreplaceable cultural inheritance that previous generations created, maintained, and bequeathed to us for our benefit and enjoyment. This collaborative effort means actively supporting institutions that maintain traditional standards of excellence, whether schools that teach classical curricula, museums that display authentic masterworks rather than fashionable novelties, churches that preserve sacred music and architectural heritage, or civic organizations that work to protect historic neighborhoods from thoughtless development and commercial exploitation. It also means creating entirely new institutions when existing ones abandon their proper mission and responsibility. If our universities no longer teach students to love what is beautiful, true, and good, we must establish alternative educational institutions that fulfill this essential cultural function. If our museums display conceptual art and political propaganda instead of genuine artistic achievement, we must support independent galleries and traveling exhibitions that maintain proper standards of aesthetic discrimination. The resistance to systematic ugliness requires both aesthetic sensitivity and moral courage. We must be prepared to defend standards that our relativistic culture increasingly rejects as elitist, exclusionary, or culturally oppressive. We must be willing to be dismissed as backward, irrelevant, or hopelessly out of touch with contemporary realities. But we must remember that every great cultural achievement in human history was once considered impossible by the practically minded and offensive by the self-styled progressives of its era. The beauty we create, preserve, and defend today will constitute the cultural inheritance we leave to future generations. When they inevitably ask what we did during the great aesthetic crisis of our time, we must be able to answer with integrity that we stood firmly for what was excellent, true, and beautiful against all the forces of degradation, cynicism, and despair that sought to convince us that such standards were meaningless illusions. Conclusion. Beauty is not a luxury that we add to life when more pressing material concerns have been satisfied, but an absolute necessity for meaningful human existence, as essential to our spiritual well-being as truth is to our minds and goodness to our moral lives. When we lose our capacity to recognize, create, and preserve what is genuinely beautiful, we lose something absolutely fundamental to our humanity. We become spiritual exiles in our own world, condemned to live in environments that systematically assault rather than nourish our deepest needs and highest aspirations. The recovery of beauty in our time requires both unwavering personal commitment and comprehensive cultural renewal. We must educate ourselves and our children in the traditional arts, crafts, and forms of knowledge that connect us to the accumulated wisdom of human civilization. We must courageously resist the economic, ideological, and cultural forces that relentlessly reduce everything to the lowest common denominator of mass appeal and immediate profit. Most importantly, we must remember that beauty is both a precious gift that calls forth gratitude and a solemn responsibility that demands faithful stewardship. When we encounter something truly beautiful, whether in nature or human art, we find ourselves in the presence of a mystery that transcends our understanding while speaking directly to our hearts. In such moments of recognition and wonder, we remember what it actually means to be human rather than merely clever animals competing for resources and status.